I'm David Futransky, class of 1969 at ETHS, and the Senior Director of Institutional Advancement. Among the things I get to do at ETHS are work with the Alumni Association, our Distinguished Alumni Award Program, and the ETHS Foundation. Today we have 4 ETHS distinguished alums talking with us about healthcare in the time of pandemic. As you'll hear as they introduce themselves, 2 are medical doctors, 2 happen to be lawyers. They are going to talk about their connection to COVID, to the pandemic, to policy around it, and will provide us with, I think, a very interesting hour to go forward and learn about where we are and more particularly where we're going. I've asked Willie Miller, former ETHS school board member, member of the Distinguished Alumni Award Group, class of 1971, to be our host for today and our moderator, so I'm going to turn it over to Willie. Take it away, Willie.
Welcome to today's episode of Coming Together. My name is Willie Miller, class of 1971, and I will be your host today for today's topic, Medicine and Public Health in a Time of Pandemic. I'm joined today by Dr. Alan Kaplan, Dr. George Bridgeforth, and attorney Scott Burris. For today's discussion, I'd like to thank all of you guys for joining us. And for purposes of discussion, since I have a history with Dr. Galloping George, I'm going to start off with him first.
Always good to see old friends, Willie.
And if you want to expand on that nickname, be my guest. But George, what I'd like for you to do and what I'd like for the rest of the participants to do is to basically introduce yourself. What year did you graduate from ETHS? What are you doing now? Is there something from your ETHS days to lead you to where you are today? And how do you connect to the pandemic? If connect is the right word. So take us off, Dr. George.
My name is George Bridgeforth. I had the honor of graduating from ETHS in 1972, the year behind my esteemed teammate, Willie Miller. I have an MD from Northwestern, did my postdoctorate training in Stanford and Berkeley. Currently the director of sports medicine for the VA here in Chicago. We do have some relationships with the pandemic, having worked in the COVID-19 tent. A couple other things we just did was we just sent a proposal to the National Institute of Health, which is abbreviated the NIH, for a medication called aminoflam. We use it to treat asthma, but it has 2 off-label effects. One, it can increase respiratory function by 15%, and it also can help stabilize lung function. And if the proposal is accepted, chances are it will not be, because it's hard to get a drug tested. But if it is, it may work or help people with COVID-19 or serious cases of COVID-19.
Thank you, George. You know what? I'm going to follow up with the other doctor on our panel, Alan.
Hi, I'm Alan Kaplan. I graduated in 1961 from ETHS, and I'm a semi-retired cardiologist. I spent 37 years in clinical practice, 23 years on the Harvard teaching faculty, and 10 on the Dartmouth faculty. I currently am the medical director for New Hampshire Boy Scouts and for the Union for Reformed Judaism camping program. So my involvement with COVID has been heavy in terms of designing programs for safe reopening and actually closing them down initially last summer and then reopening. I have a aviation medical legal consulting business based on the physics that I learned from Bob Anspaugh back at ETHS many years ago, who was one of my favorite teachers. And I also have a full-time career, actually, at this point, producing and directing professional and community theater, and that came from Bill Ditton back at ETHS. So ETHS played a big role in my life and what I do today.
Alan, I like how you brought the ETHS part into how it impacted what you're doing today. So maybe we'll flesh that out a little bit more. So Scott, let you bet clean up here.
Well, I'm glad to be the young guy on this call. This is great because I didn't graduate until the advanced year of 1975.
Oh, a baby.
And I'm not quite retired yet. I am a professor of law and public health at Temple University in Philadelphia. I direct something called the Center for Public Health Law Research. And my work for the last 30 years, but certainly even more intensively for the last 10, has actually not so much been about what the law says, but what the law does. I'm a specialist in the scientific evaluation of the health effects of laws and legal practices. And so my interest in COVID arises from primarily the question of what's working, what's not working, how do we make things work better in the way of COVID control, and that's how I generally work. And I think that does come from ETHS in the sense that ETHS certainly fed my belief in social justice and my belief in the power of the mind and human cooperation to succeed with making the world a better place. And I've tried ever since to live up to that.
Excellent. So was there any instructor at ETHS that led you down the path of law?
Well, not directly. I had several instructors who taught me how to write, including the late Bennett Klein, who was my CS teacher in my junior year, and kept giving me. He would hand back papers marked ungraded. And he said, if I was going to grade this, it would be an F. So I'm going to give you another chance to write it and do better. And that kind of unrelenting, kind pressure was a huge, huge help in going, as a lawyer and as an academic. I mean, that's what I do every day. I write. And I learned that at ETHS.
So my connection was I had a instructor, well before your time, Mr. Litt, who taught business law. And that is, I took the class at ETHS and I fell in love with that business law class. And so from that on, it was all I could do to give more law classes. George, anybody at ETHS, or how did ETHS impact your avocation, where you ended up today doing?
I think the great thing about Evanston Township High School is that you can study anything that you really want to study, even Swahili. And ETHS offered, as both of you said, great writing classes, but also great science classes. And so if you wanted to get something down and express ideas and encourage people to join you and accomplish something, it was a fantastic place to study. And I can remember how tough Mrs. Panduit was and Mrs. Tillipal. And their writing expertise helped carry me forward, so much to the point where I had the opportunity of doing a book back in 2011 and working on the second textbook now.
Excellent, excellent. Well, as everyone in the country and around the world has come to know, we have been under the pandemic for almost a complete year now, or maybe a little bit more than a year. And so what I'd like to ask each one of you is, in this past year, what have you learned from the pandemic, either directly from your work or in a larger scale? And I'm going to throw that to Alan first.
Well, I think most importantly is that people need to deal with facts, and you really can't convince people who don't want to deal with facts what they're going to take as an attitude, and therefore in terms of their actions. So that's been one of the lessons. I think that the coming together of people and working on problems has led to solutions. I don't think we've ever seen a vaccine developed in this short a period of time. Skipping through the testing processes, and from the current data, it looks like with a 95%, 99% success rate with some of these vaccines, that the companies producing them have done very well. So I think bringing together people who are expert and dealing with the science can make a huge difference. On the other side of the issue, convincing people that to believe in the science, that's a tough one.
Yes, as we've seen from the day-to-day challenges. Dr. George, thoughts from you?
Well, one of the things that concerns me is that several years ago, you had a viral outbreak of a coronavirus called SARS-1. Now, last year, you have a viral outbreak or pandemic of a coronavirus called SARS-2. A lot of the same mistakes made initially with SARS-1 were made with SARS-2. And I don't see the current experts addressing the issue of how to fix that. Let me give you an example. When it first broke out in the city of Wuhan, China, there was a Chinese physician. He was an eye specialist, and his name was Dr. Li Wei-Luang. And Dr. Luang was one of the first ones to report approximately 25 cases of coronavirus. And these were people who had very severe pneumonias. And instead of being recognized and having public health measures instituted initially, what they did was they threw him in prison. And he was in prison for a month. And then when he came out after a month, he went back to his practice at Wuhan Hospital. Unfortunately, this is a young guy, 33, 34. Unfortunately, he contracted coronavirus and he died from it. So this man is a hero. He deserves a Nobel Prize in medicine. But at the same time that he was in prison, these cases of coronavirus were spreading, and the Chinese weren't working. I'm not trying to implicate them. I'm just trying to fix the problem before we get to SARS-3 or another virus. But the Chinese weren't working with the World Health Organization. And as this happened, the horse is running down the street and this virus is spreading.
Interesting.
So and all of you have I know you for a long time. Well, you and I have been friends for a long time. All of you have a passion for social justice. And one of the things that Evanston Township may consider as not only as Americans, but also as a global community and global citizens, would be to initiate a petition around the hospital where every student, every teacher, every security officer, every coach signs it. And we should consider petitioning President Biden. And we should also consider petitioning Senator Durbin to establish a petition whereby if a healthcare worker reports a condition or disease in a pandemic, that they cannot be subject to false arrest, prosecution, loss of job, or harassment. It would be a good project. It would be a good project for one of the social activist classes at ETHS to take on. If you need a template, I can send you a template. If you don't like it, toss it out. But if you do decide to do it, put my name on it somewhere. I'd be glad to join.
We put that on David Futransky's plate. But it's very interesting that you raise those topics. And so, from the standpoint of the legal aspect and perspective, Scott, what have you seen over the last year? Do you have any comments to follow up on, Dr. Allen or Dr. George's comments as to the challenges that we faced over the last year, not only from the pandemic standpoint, but the legal implications and reactions to that?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I have to confess, you sort of asked somebody who's been doing nothing but COVID for the last year to come on and say a couple of words about COVID. So the couple of words part that's going to be the hard part.
Well, you run with it. And when we start to run out of time, I'm sure William's going to tell us.
Well, we have a 250-page report from last summer on a webpage called Public Health Law Watch. So you can Google that, Public Health Law Watch Rapid COVID Legal Assessment, where 35 chapters by 50 law professors and practitioners are going into sort of where the law went well and what went wrong. But I suppose one high level thing that has become very clear, I think, over the past year has to do with how law works and the limits of what law can do. I have said that my specialty is trying to measure the effectiveness of law or measure the effect of law on health. And I often use an analogy. I say, when you're going to have a new pharmaceutical, a new pill, it generally goes through pretty exhaustive testing before it's even tried on a human being. And then as it's tried, we test whether it has effective and whether it has side effects. And then after it's out in the market, we follow it to see what it's doing and make sure that there are not unexpected bad effects, or that it really works in the real world. If you understand that law is like a pill, it's a treatment. It's something we do to change people's behavior or to change their environment. Then it's immediately clear that it doesn't make sense that we so rarely actually measure the effects of laws or look for their side effects. And when you do that, You see that actually laws can often have very severe side effects that are worse than the cure can be worse than disease. Oftentimes they're not effective. And so there's really no point in them. And of course, sometimes they're very effective, but they don't spread to everybody that should be getting that treatment. That analogy to a pill clearly doesn't work, when we're talking about COVID. Because whereas the vaccine, the molecules of the vaccine, the RNA, they'll pretty much act the same way wherever they go. There's someone. The human body is pretty much the same, so most people who get the vaccine will get the primary effect. And you can give out the vaccine in South Africa, or you can give it out in the United States, and it'll work pretty much the same way, broadly speaking. The problem with COVID is almost every country in the world has done pretty much the same thing to control it. They have used the same legal powers, the same kind of restrictions on movement, the same kind of restrictions on density of gatherings. They've shut down their schools, they've required masks, and yet the results are all over the map. Some countries managed to suppress transmission early and keep it down. Some kept it down at first and then kind of fell flat later because they just couldn't keep doing it. And others, like the United States, have largely failed on a consistent basis for the entire course of the epidemic. But what's the reason for that? The reason for that is that you can't understand the measures we take against COVID without accepting that they are going to be limited or going to be influenced by the social and political context. In a country where mask wearing does not become politicized, mask wearing is going to be a lot more widespread and be more effective. In a country where, there's not pressure there's less pressure on governors to stop business closures early, business closures will go on longer. You'll have less protest and better leadership. These are all intrinsic to the fight against the virus, which ultimately leads to the conclusion that a virus is not a test of your public health system. It's not a test of your medical system. It's not a test of your legal system. It's ultimately a test of your society and of your society's capacity to adapt in the face of this kind of stress. And, in that sense, nowhere in the world's doing a great job. And some of us have a long way to go to get this, to get up to a level we'd like to see of social responsibility and cooperation and control.
Scott, how much of that would you assign to leadership versus just community approach to things? Can leaders make a difference here?
Well, we see the difference between Germany and the United States, or Australia. I mean, I leave out the big island countries like Australia and New Zealand because they were really able to close their borders and mostly just keep the virus out. They had very small outbreaks. But, Europe is a better comparison for us. We're at the top of the list, but not the very top. There are a few countries that have higher case rates and higher fatality rates than we do. There's a bunch that are quite a bit lower that seem to look like us. The UK, for example, they've struggled and fought and fussed and had political divisions, and yet overall with a stronger public health and healthcare, a more linked healthcare and public health system, and in spite of pretty bad leadership, they have managed to keep their case rates lower. Germany did really well at the beginning. It showed all this capacity to use traditional public health measures early, contact tracing, testing, that kind of stuff. But, the virus has demanded more. The virus really demanded stronger density restrictions, lockdowns. There were big questions about schools and how you do that. And Germany, even with good leadership, wasn't able to sustain it. In fact, most of Europe was just not able to sustain that kind of stringency against the natural public desire to get back to life. They let summer vacation happen. They let people travel all summer long. And that's what powered the fall spikes that they're just now finally recovering from after another round of very stringent lockdowns. I think clearly the utter, complete, absolute failure of leadership at the federal government was a huge factor. I mean, we had a president who was discouraging cooperation and discouraging, the kinds of measures that were necessary, and that contaminated our entire response. But even if we had done everything right, this is a really hard virus to fight in the modern interconnected world. And there are few absolute success stories.
Yeah, yes, very challenging. So, from a societal legal perspective, throw this out to the group, and I think that Scott, you've touched on it quite a bit, but have we learned anything? What are the moves for us going forward as we head into 2021 and try to deal with the vaccine and just trying to work our way out of this?
It looks
I think
like
one of the points that was brought up earlier is that about a third or 40% of the American population is very skeptical about receiving the vaccine. And from a public health standpoint, it's very difficult to address that type of misinformation. But at the same time, that's a battle that needs to be fought, and that's a battle that needs to be won. You always hear this concept about herd immunity, and what that means is that when approximately 80% of the population has been immunized, in other words, received the vaccine, there's probably a general protection for the population at large. So we do have to develop specific measures to really combat that ignorance.
Alan?
I think when you look across the states in the U.S., that you see a great variability. Iowa currently has a positivity rate of 28%, whereas Illinois is down around 7%. New Hampshire is about 6.8% right now. So there are areas that are doing it right and areas that are not. And I think some of that comes back to the leadership, but some of it, interestingly, has been tied to events. So you saw the spikes after Thanksgiving, you saw the spikes after Christmas, you saw the spikes with New Year's. So part of the education process really needs to be directed at getting people to understand that these close gatherings are really what's causing those numbers to rise. And currently, reopening is recommended at 5% or below. When you can reopen schools and a lot of other places, and I would say only about a third of the country is really at that point. So I heard you talking about the basketball team or football team earlier having their first game. I think it was basketball.
Basketball. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it raises questions and concerns when you start bringing people together. Clearly, maybe Scott has more to say about this, but the kids don't seem to get affected very much, or they get affected deadly with it. But most of them tolerate it pretty well. But the big concern is by the teachers. So you're seeing teachers, organizations across the country who are saying, why aren't we in the first groups getting vaccinated if we're going to reopen the schools?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what about the old adage that you can lead a horse to water? I mean, how do we deal with that?
Put the vaccine in the water.
Hmm? Put the vaccine in the water. And I would drink that water. I've been waiting in line to try to get my vaccine, so I'm a big proponent. But that's a real big challenge as we move forward to this, is to get the right understanding and the level of understanding, which continues to be a challenge. And I think it's part of the leadership issue, and potentially, how we can coordinate a response both at the federal level and the state level. And that sort of comes back to me, Scott, on the public health law aspect of it. It's hard to dictate, but what can we do?
Well, I mean, I think one of our findings from the first assessment that we did was that the law was actually pretty good. In fact, if there was any kind of problem in our preparing for this virus, it was that there was way too much attention to what was on paper. You probably all heard that there was a big exercise in 2019 in which federal health agencies got together and simulated what would happen if there was an outbreak of a flu virus, kind of pretty much like SARS-CoV-2. And what this exercise showed, as many had in the past, was that the system would break down. that people wouldn't know what to do, that there'd be a massive shortage of PPE, and that the virus would quickly overwhelm traditional public health capacity. And once again, people looked at that and said, well, that's really interesting. We should, and they stamped it interesting, and top interesting, and they put it on the shelf, and they went on about their daily life. So I think, the big, for me, if I was going to sum up, what I would like to see more of in the future, believe it or not, it's bureaucracy. Over the last 20 or 25 years, let me put this way, bureaucracy. We have fought this epidemic with our public health government hand, and even longer. There's been a decline in the funding for public health agencies from the top at the federal government down to your local health agency. More and more, the staffs have gotten smaller. They've gotten more demoralized. Some of the better people have left, even at places like CDC. And they haven't been replaced. And what that meant was, starting off before the Trump administration, there was actually a CDC team in Beijing at the China CDC, watching out for things like this. And they would have known a few weeks earlier than we knew about what was going on, but they weren't there. That had been cut. That budget was gone. When we started to have people, when we started to notice there was a virus and people said, hey, it's in China, we better check flights coming in. There's an interesting report in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Reports, the CDC weekly magazine of germs and terror, in which CDC describes what happened in the West Coast. The idea was that as people flew back to Seattle and Los Angeles and all the big cities from China, that as they got off the plane, they would be assessed by public health service officials or state health officials, and they would be, we'd find out who they were, we'd find out where they were going to be, so that we could trace and make sure that they confined themselves and watch them for signs of the virus. You'd imagine that this was all computerized, but no. The people at the border would take those forms filled out by hand, add some address information in the corners in smeared pencil, get them all wet, crumple them up, then fax them to the state health departments. So first of all, they weren't even legible if they got there. Second of all, the health department long and go and trace people. We hear a lot about contact tracing. We hear about efforts to increase the staff, but that's because we'd let that staff go. If you think about PPE and the need for masks and gowns, the Department of Health and Human Services is the same as the Defense Department legally, in the sense that they have the authority under the president to identify suppliers, to mandate that certain like raw materials get sent. They'll just tell you can't sell that mask material to the blue jeans maker. You've got to sell that to this company, Johnson & Johnson, that's going to make masks because they need more raw materials, and could organize the procurement and production of these masks and make sure that they were fairly distributed throughout the country. But whereas the Department of Defense has a staff that knows where every bullet is made in America, there was nobody at HHS who could tell you anything about the supply chain for basic medical equipment. Who made it? Who made the raw materials? How much production capacity did we have? Where did it go? Those people had long ago had been fired if they'd ever been there. So, the bottom line is that over 20 years, we maybe saved, a couple of billion a year by not having, people sometimes sitting on their hands in health departments with nobody to contact trace, but having the skills and having the preparedness. And the price of that $20 billion in savings, or $30 billion in savings, has been trillions of dollars that have been lost because we could not control the epidemic early, because we did not have the capacity that Korea had to jump on it and nip it in the bud. I hope now that not only just voters, but like businesses and, the chambers of commerce will realize that if we don't want to go through this kind of pain in the future, we've got to pay for an adequate public health infrastructure from now on, or it'll just happen all over again.
To pivot to a slightly different approach here, part of the problem also is, where do people get their information? And when you're listening to a source that is discouraging you from believing science, you're not going to believe it if that's the only source that you have for your news. So here I would hearken back to ETHS. I had a fantastic speech arts course there that set me thinking about how to communicate. And I think that in terms of developing young people who want to be reporters, who want to go out and find the truth and get the information, that a high school such as ETHS can play a tremendous role. It's the long game. It's finding people now who will be there years from now when we really need to build on the information and not have all this disinformation going out.
If I could just say, I mean, just to echo that, successful societies play the long game. They invest in people the way Evanston invested in us and gave so many people a chance to go out and do great things. I'm just constantly amazed by what that investment in the 60s and 70s, produces now when I see people like on this panel.
Bismarck once said that you can't have a great country without healthy citizens. And one of the things that, as you mentioned, South Korea was able to do was when COVID hit, they had a uniform health policy, as large as the United States, but they had a uniform health policy, public health policy. So they were able to march against it lockstep. Here in the United States of America, we had 50 different governors doing 50 different things. And, as you noted, the COVID rate for Indiana was 3 times that of Illinois. Iowa was also high. Ezekiel did a nice job for Illinois. One of the things that, looking back, that we need to do in the future, though, is that CDC as an advisory board and also the Surgeon General need to advise the president. I'm sure he probably was advised that we need a uniform health policy when we combat this. So you don't have Texas doing one thing, Florida doing something else, and Illinois doing a third thing. The other thing was that from 2008 to 2012, we had a prototype, and we were trying to get to the Gates Foundation. And what it would have done was computerize globally the reporting system across the world. Nobody wanted to touch it. I got no letters from CDC, WHO, USAID, Gates, all the way across the board. So it's, I don't care if they don't take our systems, we're not trying to market it, but you're absolutely right. Something needs to be done.
Well, it seems to me from listening to you learned gentlemen talk and the frustrations that I have over the years following this is sort of comes back to me, and I know that the rest of the world, but if we limited it to the United States of America, a couple of words come to mind for me, and I'll just throw them out and get your reaction to it. And that's arrogance, stupidity, greed, or complacency. We find ourselves challenged. What do you guys feel about that?
All of the above contributed to this issue that we had and continue to have. And I think until some of those directions change, we're going to see a restart and a restart and a restart as there's more episodes. And then we've got the whole issue of the variant strains that are coming in that are going to require perhaps a different approach, perhaps additional vaccinations, or even with COVID itself, COVID-19, a yearly vaccination. So we've got to move away from those 4 words that you just said and find a way to inform people.
I mean, I think it's probably important to be honest. I hate to feel this way, but we're at the end of the beginning for sure, and maybe we're somewhere in the middle. But each new success leads to a new challenge. So I mean, the production of a vaccine on the pace we did is a testament to many years of prior research, but it's still an amazing step. And it's transformative in certain ways in terms of the technology and the potential for change. But we have a whole world to vaccinate. We are now seeing right before our eyes a process that's telling us that it won't do any good to vaccinate every American if you don't, vaccinate every Rwandan, because the variants will appear where they appear and they will spread. And the variants appear because of evolution. And that means they appear probabilistically. You have enough people replicating virus, you're going to have mutations. Some of those mutations are going to be more dangerous. Some are going to be less dangerous. And, for a while, it's going to be a competition. So our leadership, and this is true not just in the US, but it's true globally, we're managing sort of to almost get our vaccination programs going in the developed countries, in the OECD countries. We're so far from taking serious action to successfully spread vaccination rapidly to the rest of the world. That's a huge challenge, and we haven't quite started getting to it yet. And this won't be over until it's over everywhere.
Talking to Pfizer about that last week, and one of the things that they were emphasizing that they're going to push their antiviral drugs and they're going to push the vaccinations. And you're absolutely right. That's long term. That's the way to go. But we're explaining to them, by the time you vaccinate the entire world and cover the mutants, you're looking at 3 to 5 years. People are dying right now from COVID. So that's why we were asked to take a look at aminophylline. Aminophylline is cheap. It's already developed. You don't have to recreate it. We know it. I've used it as a resident for 20 years. By increasing their respiratory function, it may work, and it may work to get people off of ventilators, and it may work in poor countries where you don't have ventilators. We'll see where it goes.
Scott, any ideas how we can deal with the disproportion of vaccine and healthcare and aid going to communities that are most of threat, particularly our Latino and Black communities that have such a higher death rate and infection rate?
As you know, in medicine, as you know, the money goes, the hospitals go, and healthcare goes where the money goes. But one of the things that you could start doing, especially in Black and Latino communities, is using the churches. Some of the mega churches are huge. They have wide sites. They're distributed throughout the country. They're distributed in rural areas. That's one of the things you could do. I think also social media. We didn't have that 20 years ago. People trust, Facebook. They trust TikTok. Educate the kids, get them on there, get, huge celebrities like Michael Jordan getting the vaccine, people that people trust getting the vaccine so that they feel that it's safe. But also in each one of the schools like Evanston, teach the young students how the vaccines work so they can get out and get the word out. And that's one of the things that we need to do.
But George, I think all of that is absolutely right, absolutely perfect. And I'm glad, Alan, you brought it back to the underserved communities. Well, how do we get the vaccine?
That's a good question. It's a good question. The fact that they were able to make new vaccines within 60 days is absolutely amazing. But there are still logistical problems. Like if you look at the Pfizer vaccine, okay, it starts in Chesterton, Minnesota, and they make the first part. Then they send it to Andover, Massachusetts. They make the second part. And then it goes to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and they make the third part. So I think that one of the things that's going to happen in terms of the vaccine as more and more players get into it, like Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, you'll see more vaccines on the market. But also the primary players will also start to make more and more vaccines. But it's just not, unfortunately, it's just not going to happen tomorrow.
So that's the supply side, and I couldn't agree with you more about that. I think they're doing their best. I just don't see any sign that the pharmaceutical companies are trying to hold us up or anything, or they're trying, but there are realities of production, as George said. I mean, to me, this is kind of the casebook example of structural racism. Nobody has to say, I don't care about the Black people. It's just the way the system works. The good stuff goes to the people who, have more already. If you start sending most of your vaccines through health systems, and you do that because they've got the refrigerators and they've got the pharmacists and the nurses and the doctors to do the jabs, well, people who are into the health system are going to get that first. And you're going to end up having family members of, lab techs getting their vaccine because they're just in the right place at the right time. If you don't have a way to, if you haven't yet developed an alternative distribution system, well, then that makes sense. We had a year to develop an alternative distribution system. Apparently we didn't. We don't even have software that works, on a national basis to develop, to maintain an immunization system. There's two competing versions now, one that CDC paid a consulting firm to make, and another that a vaccine, somebody with a lot of experience in vaccine distribution made. Neither of them really are fully operative, and it's just amazingly frustrating that South Korea could have an app that follows every person in the country and sends the messages.
Trust me, that's
and
part
we
of our
can't get an
proposal
app
back in 2008.
that Right. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, we just do not, we haven't prepared, but the most frustrating thing is we haven't taken the next step. Now, hopefully, you know, I mean, another way to think about this is if you go back to any epidemic in the past, and many of them have been well documented, but say go back to flu in 1980, you know, at the end of the World War I, it was the same story. I mean, we didn't have vaccines, but like things played out so similar. There was variation from city to city and state to state. Some places were better. There was political fighting. There was, you know, arguments over supplies. I mean, at a certain point, you have to realize, you know what, it's not going to be perfect. So I'm prepared to take a deep breath and say, okay, we have a new team in there. But if we do not now throw resources in the next Relief Act at cities so they can hire staff, so that they can buy refrigerators, so, you know, we can start getting ready for when when the vaccines arrive that are one shot, when the vaccines arrive that don't need the freezer, that we're ready to move them through the churches. Or already, I mean, just today it's announced that we're going to start using community health centers, federally qualified health centers. That's a good news. But, you know, we got to get that. Now is the time to lay that infrastructure so that when supply catches up, we're ready. And, you know, as it is, I know I'm registered on about 14 websites, hoping that somebody somewhere might actually find my name in some computer and call me someday to tell me to go somewhere, God knows where, to get my vaccine. And until we have a better system than that, we're also going to have, you know, inequities.
What about the kids who didn't get an education this year? What do we do about them? Because I think that's a whole big area, particularly talking on a school webinar now. I think it's something that we have an obligation to think about as well. Yeah. This has been a tough year for kids.
And let me just say, I think that's a great question. And let me just tag on to that. What about the kids who've lost out on a year? And how do you feel about the challenges of sending kids back to school when we don't really have complete information on how to do that effectively? That's a two-parter. Anybody?
I was a Chicago public school teacher, so I'm biased. You know,
seriously,
I would be, you know, what I would recommend seriously is that, you know, you should wear masks, maintain social distancing, have hand sanitizers. But I also would be in favor, and I think the teachers were right. They should have been pushed into a stronger tier so that they received, 2 doses of the vaccine with a 2-week break before they went back into the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a kind of the lack of leadership can mean lack of somebody saying the right thing in a compelling way consistently to the public, but it also means actually having a plan. Yeah. And schools are one of the hardest things to have a plan for, because it's not just the school. School transmission isn't. We don't have transmission in places. We have transmission in places in systems. And so, you know, there's been a lot of talk about, well, you can open schools if you close bars, or, you know, so I mean, there's various kinds of ways in which you can keep the overall community level low if you think about it as a system. And of course, if you think about it as a system, you also realize the teachers are crucial. If we don't make sure that the teachers are safe, how do you run a school? And so the idea that teachers are not right at the top in 1A and getting back, I mean, that's what you would do if you wanted to get schools open. You vaccinate all the teachers as fast as possible, and then you would think about what you have to do to compensate for the exposures that are going to happen in kids going to school and going home. And, you know, again, it's just the thing that makes you shake your head is, who's in charge here? Why is it the teachers who are saying, hey, maybe you should vaccinate us? Yeah. You know, well, why does it have to be their idea? So, I mean, yeah, because I think it's a good point that David makes in the chat that, you know, social distancing is not really, I think, that realistic in school. You might do more outdoor instruction in some climates, and you might have smaller classes. But in the end, you know, the vaccine is what should make it possible to open, but it won't make it possible if we sit on it if it's next fall. And as you know, as Alan said, we have other costs here. We have a lost generation of students at this point, and they need to get back into school. And then we also have to think about what we do over the summer. and through enrichment programs or otherwise to make sure that these kids can catch up.
Well, so that goes back to me, sort of the domino effect theory. We're talking about the economy, kids going back to school, parents staying at home. I've always suffered with this challenge of all of this to me, and you guys weigh in here, please, on it seems like the first domino has got to be getting the kids back to school. And then things play off of that to me. And I don't understand, or I'm challenged to figure out why that's not an acceptable approach, or people haven't moved more rapidly to put that in place.
I think it goes back to their excellent point about lack of national leadership. Nobody sat down at a national level with the teachers and developed a comprehensive plan that the teachers would accept so that they were comfortable getting back into the classroom. And I think it's a great point that they make.
It does make me think of happy memories, though, in a sense. Let me see if I can convince you guys. But, I remember when I was a kid in Evanston, we were free range kids. My parents both worked, but, we were outdoors or, doing our thing, and we survived. We were fine. And I've noticed in my neighborhood outside Philadelphia, more and more kids just appearing somewhere on bikes or in groups wandering around in a way that they weren't, a few years ago in this era of more helicopter or lawnmower parenting. So at least one nice thing is I think hopefully we've learned in this year that kids have a lot more resiliency, independence, and capacity than maybe, we've been realizing in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
Helicopter parents are just not available to hover.
Well,
exactly.
Yeah. But that goes to the fact of, and I was like you, Scott, I didn't live too far from the high school. I went to school in the morning and I came home. Usually when I left, parents had already gone to work. When I got home, they weren't there unless I had football practice with George. And then we got out late and then they were able to get home. But different times call for different extreme measures. And I'm not sure that we've made that adjustment yet. I'm going to go back to a point that Alan brought up a little bit before, in the interest of time, we do that, but I don't want to lose this. And that is thoughts on the lost year of education for our children. Is it worth it to try to make it up? Or do we say, kids generally develop at the rate that they develop at. And so when it's time to educate them, we will get them educated, but there's that emotional component in there too.
Well, I think it's affected different groups of kids different ways. There are certainly some who were very adept at learning on the computer, but there were a large number for whom this was either not a good learning style or simply not available. I'm part of a nonprofit group here in New Hampshire that's setting up free computers for kids who are in underserved populations so that they could take advantage of some of the teaching, because we've got kids who just don't even have the technology available to them. So I think in terms of where you go, trying to get enrichment programs available as much as possible, I think would be helpful. There may be some discussions about summer schools that becoming a regular semester, at least for a year or two, to help kids catch up. But the impact is going to be down the road. The impact is going to be with a whole cadre of kids who didn't have the advantages that George and Scott and I had, and you, Willie, when we were getting that constant input from teachers and such throughout the year. And that worries me in terms of where the country's going to go.
Just an interesting point. David points out in the chat that every kid at ETHS has a Chromebook and Wi-Fi. And so, again, we have to feel fortunate that we have ETHS for our backgrounds and for our current student population. But everyone is not as fortunate as ETHS, which is the challenge. So,
yeah, I kind of.
Go ahead, Scott. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, I think one of the ways that ETHS shaped me was that although, I thought there's always room for improvement. No place is perfect. That Evanston showed what public education could be. And I thought in my naivete that pretty much everybody had that kind of public education. I've since learned that, of course, they don't, but I still don't understand why they can't. It's not like, Bill Gates came along and gave Evanston a special lot of money. Over many, many years, the school district and the voters and the citizens have nurtured and supported this, and the staff has brought it to life. We're proof of concept here. I guess I would say if I could wish for anything for education, it's that we get everybody up to the standard of ETHS, and I don't know why we haven't.
We're number one.
Well, we're damn good. We're humble,
We're damn good.
hardworking. We're good.
Go ahead, George.
I tweeted a 16-year-old, 17-year-old basketball player a few years ago. He was addicted to crack, and he played for one of the Chicago public schools, and he shot 22 points a game. And I said to him, "Why aren't you in college?" And it came down to he couldn't read or write.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to put him in some reading education programs that would work with him. But unfortunately, at that point, his addiction was too bad, and he was too far behind the curve, and we couldn't do it. But it's a generation that's worth fighting for, because you don't want to lose a Martin Luther King, you don't want to lose a Michelle Obama, you don't want to lose a Madeleine Albright, and you're absolutely right. We have to do the catch-up programs.
Reach one, teach one.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the interest of time, I want to move, because we've been very heavy for the majority of our conversation. And I don't know how many of you guys are golfers. Anybody besides me? Well, there's a portion on the Golf Channel that's hosted by David Faraday, and we move away from the heavy topics to try to put a little levity into this. So I have a couple of rapid fire questions that I'm going to hit each of you with, and we'll just see where it goes. These are just fun. These are not heavy questions, and then we'll finish up with a follow-up. So for each of you, which school? Alan, north, south, east, or west?
East.
George.
Go Beardsley.
Who?
North.
I was just kidding. Scott.
Yeah, that's what we used to call it, Beardsley, when I was there, but north.
Oh
North
my
all the
God,
way.
I'm the only South Hall representative. Orange or blue?
Blue.
Blue.
Both.
George.
Both.
Both. Scott.
I guess I'm orange.
I'm going to be neutral with George. I'm like right in the middle. All right. Favorite E-Town eating place back in the day? And tell me again what your back in the day was, your year of graduation.
61, B&G's down on Church Street.
B&G's, what is that?
Stood for Belch and Groan. Everybody went in for a Coke and and fries with ketchup on it.
Was that the soda shop that was on the corner?
It was right on the corner, yeah.
Absolutely, I remember that. That's where the buses used to stop.
That's right.
That's right. George.
Patron's Chocolate Shop on Main Street. It's a funny story. I was in there with my, I knew Mr. Patron, and I know the kids. I went to school with them, Fred and David. But anyway, I was in there with my son, and I told them it's the greatest chocolate shop in the world. They've been the royal chocolatiers for Belgium for over 400 years. Fred leans over the counter. He says, "No, we weren't." I said, "Be quiet. Keep the legend alive."
Keep the legend alive. And that year of graduation?
Yep.
1972?
Same place.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Scott.
Well, in 73, 74, 75, after, a nice Saturday night of partying with the friends, we used to go to, I hate to say it, the International House of Pancakes to have, breakfast.
That's awesome. Well, I'm actually surprised and curious to say that no one said Bill's on Asbury. I still go to Bill's to this day. So that's another one. Did you have a hangout other than eateries that you used to go to kill time?
Yep. Football field.
Yeah, that's where we spent all of our free time, right,
exactly.
George?
The Baha'i Temple, they had a great parking area for late at night.
I don't know if we're old enough to hear any more about that, Alan. Scott?
I think I've got the name right. I think it was called Laurie's Records. It was a record store on Sherman, up towards the northwestern side. And I used to spend hours in there going through the stacks of vinyl records, spending my allowance on music.
Was that down by the old Varsity Theater?
Past there.
I remember that shop. Yeah, I remember that shop.
So Bill's was about 4 blocks from my house. I used to go there, and I still make my hot dogs when my wife lets me have one, just like I made them at Bill's. With the tomato
Beach is really pretty at night. Yeah.
Those are all you can't go wrong. All fabulous places, and all I'm sure have fantastic memories for us all. So I'm going to end with this last question. I know we've probably touched on it a lot here, but because I have my mask here, I'm very strict on my mask wearing. The $1 billion question is, when will this end? Is it our new normal? Or is there a post-COVID world we can look forward to?
I think it will end, but it's going to take some time because we're going to have to deal with the mutants. But the other question, and I'm going to answer a question with a question. Are we ready for the next one?
You've terrified me, George, but it's a good terror. I think we need to know that.
I think this particular one and the sub-viruses will be 3 to 5 years before we're really back to anything close to normal. There will be a new normal, which will include social distancing and masking for at least the next 1 to 2 years. But I think there's light at the end of the tunnel, but only if we deal with some of the issues that Scott identified in terms of our centralized government, some of the social issues, and particularly the information issues, trying to get people out there who can pursue the truth and effectively communicate that to populations that are either resistant or have a source of information that is giving them a bum steer.
Scott, you get the last word.
I think that's probably right. You know, it's the new flu, and we'll be getting our annual COVID shots to deal with the new variants, and we'll be living a slightly more careful life for a long time to come. I'm sure hoping that by the summer, at least we can go to the beach.
Well, let's hope so. Let's hope so. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you. It has been my honor and privilege to be joined by such a distinguished panel, Dr. Alan Kaplan, Dr. George Bridgeforth, and Attorney Scott Burris. I am Willie Miller, class of 1971, and it's a great day to be a Wildcat. And with that, I guess we'll sign off and turn it back over to William.
Thank you, Willie. Go Kids.
Go Kids.
Wow. Once more, I am overwhelmed by ETHS alumni. This is our 4th program where we've had distinguished alumni together talking, and each one has shown it's being an alum, being a part of the ETHS community is something to be really proud of. Thank you, Willie, for hosting and moderating. George, a lot of great insight, and we appreciate your views and your input. Alan and Scott, thank you for enlightening us. It was a most interesting session. There was a lot there about how do we coordinate events and how do we coordinate groups to move forward. A lot of great ideas, and I found it once more very, very interesting. 2 things to look forward to. One is WILD, the virtual benefit this year of the ETHS Foundation. You can go to www.supporteths.org. The event is on February 27th. It'll run about 45 minutes to an hour online. There are sponsorship opportunities, but you can also pay what you want to come to the event. There will be some raffles, but a lot of great entertainment. and looks at what is going on at ETHS. So we hope you'll join us there. Additionally, we have our March program scheduled. We're going to take a look at the role of the press in democracy and free society. We have 3 Pulitzer Prize winning alumni who are going to participate in that. Jeffrey Gettleman is the New York Times South Asia branch chief located in Delhi. He's won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting in Africa. Megan Toohey is a Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times reporter who worked on national issues and has taken a look at people who have been, who were part of Me Too and have led us to shine a light on the Me Too movement and why it is coming to being. And Rick Tulsky, who is won a Pulitzer for investigative reporting on a local level. So we have a great show the 3rd Wednesday in March. Thank you for being with us. As always, it's a great day to be a Wildcat.